not curious what's going on out there?
Everything is feeling a bit unbelievable.
Ray, get out here, please.
I've been doing some research.
Oh, wow. This really is the end of the world.
Alrighty, Mel, thank you so much for joining us here at Switch. I really appreciate your time. So let's dive into Biosphere. Look, I honestly don't feel like I've ever been so unprepared for an interview in my entire life, just knowing that I can say so very little about this film without actually giving it all away. So how have you been describing this story to people to try and avoid all of those key moments, which seems to be pretty much everything after about the first 5 or 10 minutes?
Yeah, it's real hard. I mean, there's like the base, line of like, it's the last two men on Earth, who, when their food supply runs out, have to figure out how to evolve. And then after that, it's like, oh man. I mean, you can talk about the big themes, which I think just the fact that like the last two people on Earth are men right off the bat is like, there's clearly some stuff there to tackle. Toxic masculinity, like why are they the last two? And just like digging into some of those themes of like of politics in America, gender, survival, science, all of that. So we can say like big terms.
And look, that's probably the best way to go into it, because the best part of this film is actually getting to see it all unfold. And I loved hearing you talk about this film when I got to see it at the Sydney Film Festival. The project for you goes back quite a long while, actually. I guess as so many creative endeavours do. How did the idea of Biosphere come to life for you?
Yeah, I have been running Mark Duplass and Jay Duplass's company, the Duplass brothers, for many, many years, and which was sort of like a detour along my path to directing. But I love producing movies and just got caught up in it for like 10, 15 years. But it's always been this understanding of at some point we're carving out in the company Mel directing, and just been trying to figure out what's my first feature, because I've done a lot of our TV. And so over the years, Mark just pitches me things. And at some point he just said, hey, what about the last two men on Earth? And they're living in a biosphere, and maybe they're obsessed with the Mario Brothers. And he pitched that. And again, I was like, okay, cool, awesome. Last people on Earth, men, a lot that I can do there with a female perspective, and a lot of science research I can do as to, how they're surviving. So it really came from there. I just saw this sort of like container where I could throw in a bunch of things that interest me.
Well, you really took that and ran with it, because, I mean, from that initial idea, it's just grown to so much more. I mean, you had these two really excellent cast members to work with. I mean, that was really fortunate, because they're really the foundation of the film here. They're in absolutely every second of it. And you said you have such a strong history with Mark. How did you find working with him so intensely for the entire length of this project?
I mean, Mark and I have worked together so intensely for so long. I think we view ourselves as brother and sister. So this just felt like a further extension of that. In fact, I think part of the chemistry that Mark and Sterling were able to get to, because they went in, like I took them to dinner 3 days before we started shooting. They didn't know each other at all. But there's such this beautiful, intense chemistry between the two of them. And I think some of that was the fact that Mark and I had such intense chemistry and history that he was sort of able to let a lot of things go and hand it over to me. And we created this really great, safe kind of familial space for Sterling to come in and kind of attach to that energy. And so I think there was sort of this like passing of the baton at some point, I think like halfway into day one, where Mark's like, oh, you got this. I'm just going to go be an actor. And then from that point on, it was, there would be times where Sterling would be like, you guys are talking to each other, but you're not saying any words. And we'd be like, well, we have just such a history. We know how to communicate with very little, and often know what the other is thinking.
And I love how that friendship actually kind of has a couple of nods in the screenplay as well. That's so cool that there's a few little in their friendship from your friendship, which is fantastic.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, not the toxic stuff,
Fortunately,
but
not
yeah,
that
there are
part of
some
it.
little, yes, there are some little nods, like I think I mentioned the Mario Brothers, but that was something that Mark infused into the script. That was one of his contributions was, he's like, I'm sort of like Mario, where like we both make things together, but our name is the Mario Brothers, like the Duplass brothers. But he's like, but you're like the secret sauce that nobody knows about behind me. He's like, you're my Luigi.
That's very, very cute. I mean, so as you say, Sterling was kind of a late arriver to this dynamic. I mean, how did he come on board to this project? How did he find the script and just come into the project itself?
Yeah, I mean, we wrote it with him in mind. I think from day one, when Mark and I first started outlining it, I wrote in the margins like Sterling K. Brown, and that's who we envisioned and who I wrote the dialogue for with him in
Amazing.
mind. And yeah, so it was, I mean, this never happens, but I sent it to him, and I think he read it. He literally read it overnight and called the very next morning and was like, I'm in. And that was it. And that's so rare. It does not
So
happen.
lucky. Well, I mean,
Very lucky.
I think it works because it obviously shows on screen that relationship does work, and it pretty much shows that you were writing for that particular actor. And I mean, that's fantastic. It shows the follow through that this project has had. I mean, the other fantastic thing, which was a first for you, was your first time directing here, which is just one more achievement for Biosphere. It's a sad fact to say, but we do need more female directors and more queer directors so that we can have these unique, amazing movies. But this was also such a huge accomplishment for you personally, and I know from what you were saying at Sydney Film Festival, this was just one you were so determined to see happen.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, it really has been like, it was almost like 30 years in the making of, just kept kind of putting aside like, right, I'm going to keep doing what I'm doing. I'm going to produce all these other films. And at some point I'll direct my own film. And it's just like the years go by and go by. And so at a certain point I think it was the right time, the right components of like what I could do with this and what excited me about the places I could take and some boundaries I could push, which I always felt like for my first feature directorial debut, I wanted to do something that felt very me, but also something, and this I guess is me too, where I could really push some boundaries and really make something that stood out. And so when I saw that and felt that in this story, I knew it was the one. And also it was life, life kind of all happened at once, some events, one of them being the pandemic, and just kind of being reflective and realizing we don't know how much time we have. And so that really kind of kicked my butt into gear to ultimately make it.
Well, it's funny that you mentioned that. I kind of wanted to know what life was like on set, because it did seem like you would be shooting mid-pandemic. I mean, and you're on such a closed set. It would be kind of eerie filming about this post-apocalyptic world in this little enclosed bubble, essentially. I mean, what was life like in this little world that's almost, a character unto itself?
Yeah. I mean, the amazing thing is we were able to practically build the biosphere. The only thing that's CGI is ultimately a bit of the ceiling. So it really did feel, it allowed us, cast and crew to all feel like we really were living in this biodome. Even so much as there's times where we see 360 in the world and we had to be enclosed into there was one wall that could move and get us out. And there were a few times where it was like, last call for pee break and you're in and go. And then there was like a tiny little hole that we had in one of the windows that you could open and get past the snack if you needed it. But it was, I think more than anything, we had all, we were kind of coming out of the time where we were super isolated, that period of the pandemic. So I think there was something also just exciting about being with other people and other humans. But we also had every single one of us now this understanding of what it would be like to be alone and sequestered in one space for a long period of time, and maybe sometimes with just one other person. So it suddenly became believable in a way that we were never anticipating when we first came up with the concept.
I mean, that's great to say in theory, but then in practice, what you've actually given yourself is this tiny little space to shoot in, and does really limit you. But in the way that it came across, it's quite fantastic in that, you know, I was sitting there and never once bored. You've come across with all these fantastic camera angles and there's so much movement. I mean, that opening shot alone, that really must have like driven your crew crazy. Just you must have had so many takes on that and probably driven your camera operator, like given them vertigo or something like that. But I mean, how did you keep it interesting, to keep that momentum up, find different angles, different shots to keep things different inside the dome?
Yeah. Well, that that first shot, I think we only got 3 takes because
Wow.
the poor key grip, who was the one running, pulling the rig, his legs kept cramping up, and at a certain point, he's like, "I can't do this anymore."
Fair enough.
Which was phenomenal because my dream was to get it in 1 take, and there was one where I was like, "That was good enough. I'm done." But no, it was, you know, it's always a challenge because I shoot a lot of films in kind of one location type settings. And it's always a challenge for it to feel different, to just keep it interesting. And I think that was a big thing. One that I talked to my production designer, Megan Fenton, about quite a bit was taking this thing that was essentially one room, but sectioning it off to feel like it had different rooms. But there was also this sense of like you could be alone, but you could never truly be alone. Even so much as like the bathroom has a glass wall, so there's no sense of full privacy ever. And that also allowed us to do really cool things and different ways of shooting through the glass. And then my director of photography, Nate Miller, he also approached it, and we worked together for years. So we had kind of been versed on the how to work in a very small space. And, you know, right off the bat, you know, we had shot listed everything, but I think shot listing is just a way to be prepared to change things on the day. And it really was like you would shoot it and you would go, something feels familiar. I'm having deja vu. Oh, something already was shot in a similar way. Let's move it. Let's find a new corner of the round dome, and add movement. I think the movement is the big thing, is knowing and picking and choosing when we were going to really follow the actors emotionally, but also to change up the energy. That was a big part of it.
Well, I mean, from what I do recall from your talk at Sydney Film Festival as well, you were dealing with 2 very conflicting personalities with the actors as well. It sounds like that kind of on-the-fly approach would work very well in that scenario too. I mean, perhaps that shooting style lent itself really well, and that flexibility would lend itself really well with that particular, you know, spontaneity too.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. I mean, I think it was a good mix of certain moments and shots where there was flexibility for Mark and Sterling to kind of improv a little bit in their spaces. And then there were other very, you know, set up, calculated shots. So I think knowing we'd have a mix of those would also help us to keep the energy from never feeling too stale.
Well, look, as you said, there's a lot of those big picture ideas to this film, but you know, it's really heavily sweetened with a lot of comedy in there, and obviously that really helps send that message along, and I guess depending on your audience probably makes it a lot more digestible. I mean, how did you make sure you were maintaining the right balance of tone, whether that be in the writing process or on set or in the edit suite?
Yeah, you know, this film is sort of packaged as one film to get people in their seats. And hopefully a lot of people who might not normally sign up for this type of journey in a film, you know, and just to be open to the ride. And I think a big part of that was, you know, it is in the package of a science fiction film. And then the other big element is the comedy. And I'm a big believer in comedy. I think it's unifying. I think it lets our guards down so we can be open to new things. And I mean that in a beautiful way. And it's also just fun. And I think it just keeps people engaged when they're laughing. So that was a big aim for me. And I don't know I mean, early on, Mark and I talked about it where we're like, there's big themes and it's the end of the world, but we want these guys to almost feel like they're in Dumb and Dumber and to have this like sort of bro-y, weird, sometimes outdated, childlike sense of humor, and to kind of like juxtapose that a little bit. So really lean into that. And then, you know, Mark and I work a lot in improv and he likes to have space for that. And I do too, but then at a certain point I was like, I really do want to dial in some like pre-calculated laughs to make sure we're kind of hitting that, where we never get too far away from the comedy and that energy, because I thought it was really important. So that was a lot of the dialogue that I spent a lot of time just like nailing what that would be. And thankfully Mark and Sterling are just like killer comedic pacers in their performance. So they were able to take that and then take it up like 5 notches.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, watching them on screen is an absolute joy. But truthfully, I mean, you've now been to Australia a couple of times. Do you find that there's perhaps a difference in audience when you're showing the film in the US to, say, places outside of the US around the world?
Absolutely. You know, I premiered the film at Toronto, and actually the second public screening of the film was in Sydney. And both were just such lovely, receptive audiences. And I think a great way to just kind of birth this film out into the world. You know, the American audiences are amazing, but America often needs to be told if it's okay to laugh, or, you know, to really like be told it's okay to go into these uncomfortable territories. And there are a lot of boundaries we're pushing with this film. I hope in a good way, you know, to progress and to push up against some rigid definitions, especially in America. So I think starting it internationally was a great way, and I think people just really embraced it. And I think when America heard people were embracing it, there was a bit of that too that I think helped. But for the most part, everybody's been really receptive and open to the film and open to that kind of journey and learning in the process. But it's funny, I noticed, you know, you've got the big cities, you know, like Sydney, Toronto, even New York and LA are very vocal audiences. You hear their journey in the theater. And then I did a bit of touring in middle America. There was, you know, there wouldn't be a lot of laughing. And then I would get done and do a Q&A, and everybody kept calling it hilarious. And I realized, I'm like, oh, they're internally having their journey. They're internally laughing. So it's just the energy in the room was always a bit different, but ultimately a very similar response.
Look, speaking of life in the United States currently, I mean, the entertainment world is in a bit of a tough place at the moment. I mean, you've got the strike going on in Hollywood. It's having a huge global impact already. I mean, what are your thoughts on what's taking place currently?
You know, I have so many feelings. I mean, I think, you know, as a member of the WGA, a part of me is on strike. You know, I'm not able to write right now, that part is heartbreaking, but also I think for very good reason, and what we're fighting for, I'm absolutely behind. But it's created this environment where I'm not sure everybody understands the rules, and that's made a lot of confusion. And what I'm actually seeing happen is that indie films are getting hurt a bit because nobody realizes they're not part of the big conglomerates. We're all like outside of that. We're the ones who we're on board to pay and, you know, and meet the requirements, but we're not the ones at the big table making decisions and negotiating. So unfortunately, right now, and I'm hoping this can change, I actually think independent films are getting hurt. You know, I think Biosphere is a good example where I'm doing an international press tour by myself when I was supposed to have Mark Duplass, one of my actors, with me. And so really kind of navigating and finding ways to figure out how we don't let these independent films be buried, I think is just as important in this fight right now. And I think spreading the message of word of mouth for these indie films so they don't get lost.
It is obviously a situation that needs a lot more discussion, and obviously one that needs to be had now. So, fingers crossed that some progress can be made. But let's end on a high note. And while we know that Mark and Sterling were the stars of the production, they did have some on-set co-stars, the Fish. And I understand you had quite a character who was there taking care of them behind the scenes.
We did. We called him Peter Fish. We did have animals on set. You know, we had live fish that we kept to a couple days, you know, and really tried to embrace fake fish and CGI when we could, just to be very safe and thoughtful with the handling of the fish. And we picked this guy, Peter Fish, because he had such a similar aesthetic, but even beyond, even so much as He wouldn't leave the fish alone. He was like, I'm going to sleep with them next to their tanks. There was never a moment where Peter wasn't taking care of those fish. So yeah, he was the fish whisperer.
It's beautiful. That's exactly what you want. Well, Mel, thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it here on Switch, and we're really looking forward to Biosphere hitting Australian cinemas.
Yeah, it will be in theaters in Australia and New Zealand September 7th. So please spread the word and help support this indie film.
Amazing. We're looking forward to it hitting on a big scale here. Fantastic. Thank you so much again for your time.
Thank you.
My Sydney Film Festival review of Biosphere is up at maketheswitch.com.au now. You can find the link in the description to this video. And remember, like it, follow it, right here at Switch.